As we make our way into the text this morning, the topic for this morning is wisdom and enemies. And last week we talked about wisdom and friends. And just to recap where we've been, we've kind of made our way through a lot of Proverbs, a lot of ground that we've covered. First, talking about our relationship to God, and kind of looked at some topics of wisdom and sin, wisdom and satisfaction, wisdom and obedience. Then kind of looked at ourselves. If this is true of us and we want to live wisely according to all that God calls us to, what does it look like for us? And so a couple of those topics have been wisdom and heart, wisdom in words, wisdom in work, and then wisdom and purity. And so last week we shifted to our relationship to others and kind of looked at wisdom and friends. The goal was to look at wisdom and friends, then wisdom and enemies, wisdom and parents, and then wisdom and children. And with the blizzard we had a few weeks ago, in order to stay on track for Easter and everything, we'll combine the last two into a sermon for next week, just wisdom and families. And so last week I asked the question, or made the statement, what would it look like for us to leverage our friendships for the sake of the gospel? I want to shift that a little bit into all of our relationships. So what would it look like even for us to leverage relationships that we have with enemies for the sake of the gospel? And you may be thinking, it's difficult enough for me to leverage the people that I love in those kinds of ways. Family, friends, that's hard. You don't know my family. It's very difficult for me to do that. So now on top of that, you're asking me to steward and leverage even my relationship with enemies. It's a big ask. It's very difficult and very intentionally so. The Bible is not comfortable when it comes to some of these categories. We tend to think of enemies in terms of warfare. So they are a combatant. They wear a different uniform. They rally under a different flag. They may be motivated by a different ideology. But the reality is that many of the people in your own world that you would classify as an enemy, they may not wear a uniform, they may not run under a flag, and yet the wounds that you've experienced are just the same. And so many of us have been wounded in relationships, in close relationships, because you make yourself vulnerable, as last week's text kind of called us to. And in the process, wounding comes. And it comes at the hands of family, of those that were really close friends or business associates or people that you invested hundreds and thousands of hours into, and wounding comes. And so I realized this is a very difficult conversation, and yet necessary. Coming from that, we really have two options with what we do with woundedness, with abuse, with wounding, with slander, with being ousted by people. There are two main responses to that in our lives. And the first is we can use it as an excuse to do the very same things. Like, I was abused as a child, so therefore it's okay for me then to abuse others. And or the flip side of that is for you to realize, I never again want to see this perpetuated in my own life, let alone in those around me. And so you use it as a catalyst to prevent those things from ever happening again. A guy I went to college with wrote a book, and all over social media, he's printed these t-shirts, and there must be thousands of people that have bought these t-shirts. And it simply says, the cycle ends with me. The cycle of brokenness, the cycle of fatherlessness, the cycle of these very things, of seeing the things that have been perpetuated toward us being allowed to continue from us. But the reality is, we talk about leveraging relationships with enemies for the sake of the gospel. This only makes sense through the lens of the gospel. There's no other framework for us to build our lives upon with this conversation in particular than the gospel, because the gospel throws everything on its head. We've seen that time and again, working our way through 2 Corinthians, everything is thrown on its head. We're called to upside down living. And so you relating to enemies is very much that as well. So you think about the 10 Commandments. The first four, deal are all vertical. They're all in relation to our understanding of God, our relating to God, our obedience to God, our glorifying of God. Martin Luther said, if you never break the first two commandments, you'll never struggle with the other eight. And that's very true, because the other six are all horizontal, dealing with murder, dealing with honesty, dealing with adultery, all of those kinds of things. And so much of the Bible throws this on its head when we talk about relating to our enemies. So think about the Gospels themselves. After our Easter series, we're going to spend 9 weeks looking at some parables in the Gospel of Luke. And it's profound to me, the language of Jesus toward this topic. Don't invite those that can pay you back. Right? They have the means of providing for themselves, the means of inviting you back into their home and repaying you. Don't invite them. No, instead, go to the outcast or lend to those that you know are not going to pay you back. This is a recurring theme that we begin to see all over the Bible. And so the truth is that we are all very comfortable loving, pursuing, engaging those that are safe. They look like us, they think like us. There's no risk involved. So think about going to a zoo and interacting with a lion. It's very safe. It's very, very comfortable. If you follow the rules, there's probably very little risk of you getting wounded, but not the same on a safari. We're not called to zoo style relationships. We love them because it's safe. We're called to risk all for the sake of the gospel when it comes to these kinds of relationships. We're called to a safari, not a zoo. And I realize that again, it's unsafe. It's uncomfortable in those kinds of settings. What I want you to see this morning, and as we make our way into this text, is this main idea that we are called to the difficult task, the very difficult task of wisely and winsomely loving our enemies, because Jesus has defeated our ultimate enemy. So again, it's not an easy task, it is very difficult, but wisely, again, looking at all of the text of Proverbs, of living wisely, but it requires some winsomeness. So difficult task of wisely and winsomely loving our enemies. And as we'll see as we make our way to the end of the text this morning, this is all possible because Jesus has defeated our ultimate enemy. So, but as we talked a little bit about last week, and especially as we talk about enemies, the brokenness of all of our relationships in our families, with our friends, with those that are enemies, all point to our ultimate need for God. The relationship that we see, that we know will never fail us, that will never leave us broken. And so I want you to rest in that as we talk about this, that our relationship with God through Christ is what will satisfy us ultimately. Because here's the reality. If you could do this on your own, it wouldn't require faith. Loving people that are easy to love probably requires a little faith, but loving those that are difficult, that have wounded us, that we would classify as enemies, wouldn't require faith. It wouldn't require us to depend on God to show up, for him to work in supernatural ways for his glory in the midst of our inadequacies and our brokenness. But the gospel disarms these kinds of conversations because it puts us all on level playing field, as we'll see as we work our way into the text. So I want to begin with a story of Nicky Cruz. Nicky Cruz is I think 81, lives in Colorado Springs, has written a number of books, and kind of travels internationally, speaking all over the place. Really has a heart for those living in the inner city, in poverty, in gangs. But that's not how his life began. So Nicky grew up in Puerto Rico and was abused by his family growing up, over and over and over. And from the age of 6 to 9, just experienced all kinds of brutality from his mother, his father, those in his family. And he shares that during that time, his heart just grew to be a heart of stone. His mom even referred to him, kind of nicknamed him the son of Satan. Just again, abuse upon abuse upon abuse. Eventually moved to the United States in the 1950s, living on the streets in New York. Joined one of the most infamous gangs there in New York, making his way eventually to be the warlord of that entire gang. A very dangerous man. Um, and and there was a young man from Philadelphia, young country preacher that felt the burden to go to New York and just preach the gospel. David Wilkerson was his name. David went on eventually to start Teen Challenge, which many of you know kind of services and serves in many capacities with those that are struggling with alcohol and drug addiction. But so David met Nicky on the street, and Nicky hated him, spit in his face, threatened him many times, beat him up on occasion, and yet David continued to preach the gospel to him. And on one occasion, Nicky threatened David with his life, and as David was preaching the gospel to Nicky, Nicky said, "I almost killed him because I was totally full of hate." And that was when he told me that Jesus loved me. It's an amazing thing as they were working their way into the gospel, and as David was sharing the gospel with Nicky, Nicky did. He threatened him. He said, "I will kill you." And David's response was, "Look, you can cut me up into 1,000 pieces and lay me in the street here, and every single piece of my body would declare to you and proclaim to you, Jesus loves you." It began the process of softening Nicky's heart, and an amazing radical transformation of those that were just thrown together in this process of David and his obedience to the gospel and preaching to Nicky, and just watching God move. So not every relationship that we are in will result in a conversion like that. And not every relationship that we're in is even the animosity that we see in a relationship like that. And yet it shows the profound dependence on the gospel of God to move in ways that we can't. And so that's the hope for us as we talk about this topic of wisdom and enemies. So before we make our way into looking at some Proverbs, I think it's necessary for us to define enemy in a little bit more practical sense. Because as I'm talking about this, many of you may think, that's not me. I've lived in the same neighborhood my whole life. I have the same friends. Yeah, I've had some disagreements, but I don't have anyone that I would really call my enemy. Well, so let's change that so we can not sidestep the importance of this text. Because even me, there are a couple people in my life that I've had disagreements with. I don't know that there's many that I would call an enemy, but I want to move us toward, again, if an enemy is someone that lives in animosity, you have animosity toward or antagonism toward. Again, that may differ in certain contexts. I want to push us toward thinking differently so this text and these texts really do apply to us. Because you may not have an opponent or an adversary, but defining this practically, I want you to think about those that think differently than you, that live differently than you, that worship differently than you, that have different lifestyles than you, that vote differently than you politically, different races, religions, again, different lifestyles. And again, I don't go into those categories because by default they are all our enemies, not at all. But I want you to think about the idea of animosity, of not someone getting in your face because you've had a disagreement or there's been abuse over time. But I want you to think about those that are different from us, because then these texts do apply. And then we begin to leverage our relationships because we're different than them, again, for the sake of the gospel. And again, even in our own community, very small, kind of isolated Southwest Minnesota, the reality of those categories are very present for us. Those that are from different races, different cultures, different ideologies, different lifestyles are all around us. And again, in today's heightened sense of everything being politicized, and if I disagree with you, then we can hate one another, rather than saying, here's the issue at hand. How do we navigate this lovingly so that we can have a conversation about what the real issues are without hating one another? That's the aim in this. So this applies 30,000 feet when we talk about real enemies that you've been wounded by, but also those on a practical, boots on the ground sense of those that just are different from us. So it's been amazing this even the past week with all of the things that have been communicated about coronavirus and COVID-19. Some of that very same language that's made its way into how this is even being discussed. So this is an issue of, this is the Chinese virus. It's their problem. It's their fault. I saw an article pop up as I was going through social media this week about the reality that if we look at the map of the United States and where this is popping up, it just happens to coincide with all the sanctuary cities. And so if we weren't letting immigrants in, we wouldn't have a problem. And I was grieved by that because it creates an us versus them mentality. And again, what we have to do, and as we make our way through these texts this morning, we have to see that we're all on the same playing field. We're all in desperate need of mercy. We're all in desperate need of grace. And the minute we have any kind of mentality of us versus them, when it comes to religion, when it comes to race, when it comes to sexuality or lifestyle, we lose. And so the gospel doesn't give us an us versus them. Paul's ideology, or Paul's view of life is those who are in Christ and those who are outside of Christ. That's the categories for him. So what I want you to see as we work our way into this text. So first point, I want you to see that we are called to walk faithfully. So three very simple statements for us to walk faithfully, love sacrificially, and wait humbly. So the first, walk faithfully. So there's three texts there that we'll look at: Proverbs 29:27, 26:23 and 24, and Proverbs 16:7. So again, the call first is to walk faithfully. So we're called to live lives of faithful obedience, regardless of any other person, regardless of any other circumstance, regardless of any situation that you face in your life. The call for us individually as believers is obedience. It's faithfulness. There are thousands of things that God uses in our lives to increase our faith and dependence on him for our good and for his glory. And again, most of those things, think of this week, most of the things that we experience, we would never choose for ourselves. We would never script for ourselves to walk through. And you can think of your own life, the course of the past year, the course of the past decade, the course of the past week, and just think about, I would never write this for myself. I would never choose this for myself. And yet God in his sovereignty lovingly places us in these situations, again, for our good and for his glory. But what he calls us to is faithful obedience. So again, God is sovereign, God is loving, God is kind. And we are called to live lives of faithful submission and obedience in all things as the creature, not the creator. So again, you can see this in the normal rhythms and patterns of your own life. But one question is, how do you view the Bible? There are two main ways to view the Bible. The first is the Bible first and foremost a book of rules, sprinkled with illustrations and stories to reinforce the rules? Or second, is it one overarching story that's sprinkled with illustrations and rules that reinforce the story? How you understand that determines everything about your understanding of God, your understanding of righteousness and obedience, of holiness, all of it. So for instance, if the Bible is all about rules and all of the stories are there to reinforce the rules, then we read stories like David and Bathsheba. See, I told you, don't commit adultery. I told you clearly, don't murder. And look at David, right? So here's an example of what happens when you don't follow the rules. The second option of this is one overarching story of God's incredible love for his people, and over and over and over their failures. And all of these stories and rules and laws and examples are there to point to this overarching story. Then it changes how we view everything, right? So the first is all about obedience. So we read the Bible and think it's all about me obeying so that I can get from God. It's all about the law. The second is all about relationship. It changes everything. The gospel does change everything. It's all about mercy. It's all about this loving God and his relentless pursuit of mankind over and over and over. It's amazing when you read the book of Hosea, this amazing story of God telling the prophet Hosea to go and marry a prostitute, love her. She's going to leave you. Go redeem her. Go marry her again. Go pursue her again. She's going to leave you. She's going to be unfaithful to you. But go love her, wash her, redeem her again and again and again. And we can read that through the lens of the law, right? And think, just do good, avoid bad, be a good boy, be a good girl. But that's not what that story is about. The story is about God and the picture of the gospel of Christ. Go redeem for yourself a people. And they, like this adulterous woman, like this prostitute, she's going to leave you. She's going to be unfaithful. So I need you to be faithful to her, pursuing her, redeeming her, washing her afresh over and over and over. It's a picture of the gospel. It's exactly what Paul says in Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives the way Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So this changes how we view the Bible. Is it all about obedience, or is it about this relationship that God has initiated with us through Christ? Look at chapter 29, verse 27 in the book of Proverbs. An unjust man is an abomination to the righteous, but one whose way is straight is an abomination to the wicked. So there's an incompatibility with holiness and righteousness and that of sin and evil. They are diametrically opposed to one another. I don't need to convince you of that. But as you look at what's being communicated there in chapter 29, verse 27, the language of abomination just means disgust or hatred. And he's saying the righteous are an abomination to those who live sinful lives, and vice versa. And so the call for us is to walk faithfully in the midst of those around us. Again, it may breed distrust, it may breed disdain, it may breed hatred. And yet the call for us is to live lives of holy, righteous obedience. Flip back just a couple chapters, chapter 26, verses 23 and 24. Like the glaze covering an earthen vessel are fervent lips with an evil heart. Whoever hates disguises himself with his lips and harbors deceit in his heart. The truth of the matter is that you, with the right glaze, you can make anything look real, look authentic, look genuine. I'm going to close these real quick. I thought we'd be okay. Yeah, so with the right glaze, you can make anything look real, anything look expensive. We did a mission trip to New York City a number of years ago and spent time in a couple different areas. And everywhere we were, everybody was peddling fake things. So fake watches and purses and T-shirts and baseball hats everywhere we were. Now it looks real, but when you're buying a purse for $7 that says Louis Vuitton on, let me just tell you, it's not real. Same with the watch, same with the shoes, same with the hats. So with the right glaze, we can make anything look authentic and look real. What Solomon is saying here is not, dress up your life with the right glaze. Just pretend, go through the rhythms, go through the motions, and everyone will think that it's authentic. No, what he's saying is live your life in faithful obedience. Again, the language that he uses there is the heart. In verse 23 and verse 24 is language of the heart, because out of the overflow of your heart, your mouth speaks. All that you do, right? The things that you are drawn to, the things that you watch on Netflix, the mouse clicks, all of it is all motivated by your heart. And he's saying, don't dress yourself up thinking that you can portray yourself one way while living differently. Let the truth of the gospel that's made its way into your heart come out in all the ways that it should. Live consistently. Think basically saying live faithfully, live authentically. That's what he's talking about here. Flip backwards a couple of chapters, actually 10 chapters, chapter 16, verse 7. We begin to see how this impacts others. So chapter 16, verse 7, when a man's ways please the Lord, all caps there. So when a man's ways please Yahweh. He makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So again, what he's saying is when you are living the way that you should in faithful obedience to God in all areas of your life, in all ways, then the logical outflow of that is not that we begin to change our neighbors, but that God working through us begins to change those around us. So listen again, when a man's ways please the Lord, he there is the subject of that is God himself, that God makes our enemies to be at peace with us. But again, this comes in faithfulness to God. So I'm not saying that the call here is not, hey, go pursue your enemies and put yourselves in uncomfortable positions around them. No, what Proverbs is pointing us to is the faithfulness of our own walk with God before them. And then let God work through us for the sake of their good and his glory. Let him work. Let God be at work. Paul says something very similar in Philippians 2, verse 13. It is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. It's God that's working. So trust God in his sovereignty, in the relationships that he's placed you in to work. We are simply called to be faithful. So walk faithfully, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the situation, regardless of the person, as uncomfortable and difficult as they are. Be faithful and trust the results of your faithfulness to God. So secondly, I want you to see our point is to love sacrificially. So love sacrificially. So a couple of verses there, chapter 10, verse 12, chapter 14, verse 29, and then chapter 25, verses 21 and 22. But as we do this, love sacrificially. It's easy to love those that are easy to love. Let's be honest. It's easy to love those who are easy to love. But as we've seen so often, as we've made our way through so many verses, so many texts, we're not called to what's easy, but to what's obedient, which usually means what's most difficult. Because again, if it was all easy, there'd be no absolute dependence on God, no faithfulness, no stepping out in what seems impossible. But that's what we're called to. Not what's easy, but what's good. And what, again, it usually means that it comes at great cost for the sake of the gospel in absolute dependence on God himself. So first, look at chapter 10, verse 12. As we look at this idea of loving sacrificially. I think we looked at this verse last week. So hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. So the imagery there of stirring stuff, truth be told, we all love to stir the pot. So someone says something, we go to someone else. We see something on Facebook, we respond. There's comments made and we respond in kind. We love to stir the pot. We do. I love to stir the pot. Again, that sarcastic edge of who I am, it comes out in different ways. And this is one of them. But again, Solomon is saying that it's hatred that motivates this stirring of the pot. It's love that chooses to cover all offenses. Again, we see that the imagery of covering is so profound as you look at it in the Bible. It begins there even in Genesis chapter 3. So Adam and Eve are there, they're naked, there's no shame. Sin enters the picture, and right away they cover themselves. They realize they're naked, they're vulnerable, they're exposed, and so they cover themselves. And God comes along, the question of where are you? Of course, he knows where they are physically. The question is one of spirituality. Where are you? What's happened? Everything's changed now. And so we see the very first sacrifice. We don't see the sacrifice, we see the fruit of the sacrifice and him covering them with the skins of animals. He covers them. And the reality of the gospel is that that's what it takes all the time. It's love that covers our sin. So this idea of what Solomon says here, love covers all offenses, we see the very same thing repeated in the New Testament. It's love that covers over a multitude of sins. It's love that covers us by faith. And so when God looks at us through the faith that we have in Christ, we are viewed spotless. It's love that motivates that. And it's love for us that motivates these very same things in our own lives, but also as recipients, but also in our relationship with others, that we love others. And it means that we cover over some of the sins that we see. It will always cost you something. We'll talk about that in a minute. Look at chapter 14, verse 29. Again, on this theme of loving sacrificially. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. So the imagery here is one of sacrifice. So we must live our lives for the sake of others. To sacrifice means that we must die. And again, as I said a minute ago, love covering over something, it will always cost you something. When you choose to forgive someone else, it will always come at a cost to you. Whether it's something simple, someone backs into your car and dents the front end, and you say, I choose to forgive you, I'll cover this. Well, now you've got to cover the cost of fixing it. It's the same thing when someone wounds you relationally and simply says, I'm sorry, please forgive me. To cover over that sin will cost you something. It will cost you something relationally in order for you to actually move closer to that person. Again, there's parts of us that have to die in the process of this idea of loving sacrificially in order to have great understanding. But the hasty temper, when we respond hastily, this temper, it lashes back. It's not sacrificial. It's not costly. And in the end, we simply respond with, I wish I wouldn't have said that, in response to the wounding that I've experienced as well. But the call for us is to die every day. As believers in Jesus Christ, the call for you and I is to die every single day, to wake up and die. I say that because Jesus' call to his disciples is, and not just those initial 12, but anyone and everyone who would follow him by faithful obedience. If you want to be my disciple, pick up your cross daily and follow me. Both of those. So to pick up the cross is an instrument of death. To follow Jesus faithfully, obediently, sacrificially, moment by moment throughout our lives requires that we die to ourselves in order to live for his sake. That's why Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. That's the profound implication of the gospel, is to die to ourselves in order to follow Christ into these uncomfortable situations, into these uncomfortable relationships. The question is, has grace changed you? Do you see the gospel working in your own life to soften the edge for those around you? Again, not those that are just easy to love. I can be difficult to love. I am. You can talk to Julie. I've got her muted right now, so you can't ask her right now. But the reality is I'm a difficult person to love. I'm a work in progress, and so are you. The question is, over the course of your life, the past week, the past month, the past year, can keep going. Have you seen grace change your life? Has the gospel changed your heart and changed your life? Because if it has, then this impacts those that we dislike as well. We begin to be transformed. We must be transformed. That the selfish cruelty in our hearts is transformed into sacrificial love for others. Look at chapter 25, verses 21 and 22. Next verse. If your enemy is hungry, notice not if your friend is hungry, not if the stranger is hungry. No, listen to this, because it's profound that Paul says picks up this verse and puts it in Romans chapter 12. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread. Let me start over because I missed the second half. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he's thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. So again, he's not calling us to, to serve those that we love, to serve those that we don't know that may be on hard times. No, serve sacrificially, uncomfortably, those that are your enemies. They're hungry, feed them. They're thirsty, give them water to drink. And in the process of this, you heap burning coals on their head. It's a very confusing thing. Like, what in the world does that mean? Well, again, the imagery there is judgment. That in the process of you serving them sacrificially, in that moment, they are convicted because they're your enemy. But yet you're serving them. And in that moment, conviction comes, judgment comes on them. And it brings about, potentially, if God is working in the process of that, like we've seen already, that you trust the results to God, not manipulation, but you trust the results to God. It begins to stir about in them repentance. So that ultimately the hope is that they don't experience judgment and the burning coals that will come for those that are outside of Christ. It's a beautiful picture of what happens when we really love those that are our enemies. We really serve those that are difficult to serve, that it brings about in them potentially, as God moves, a changed heart, a repentant life, as God so sees fit. But again, it will cost you something. You feeding them bread and giving them water, it will cost you something. It always does. Love always costs you something. Listen to Romans 12, verses 14 to 21. Again, this is where Paul takes this very same language, this text from Proverbs 25, and is applying it to all believers. So just so we're not seeing, this is just Old Testament. This is Solomon with his son. This doesn't apply to me. So Romans 12, 14 to 21, bless those who persecute you. So now even ramps up the language. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Not just those you like, not just those that it's easy. This is very convicting for me because I've quoted that verse many times with people that I know, people that are easy to be around. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. He's saying, if your enemy's weeping, weep with them. The context is those who are persecuting you. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one for evil, no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, declares the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So again, the context of Romans is Paul walking through the heart of the gospel. And he's saying, if this is true in your life, it's amazing. Romans 1 to 11 is all theology, all doctrine. And then comes, therefore, my brothers. Now he's moving practically. So Romans 12 is all about practical outworking of the gospel in your life. But Romans chapter 5, again, sets the groundwork all level between all of us, this side of eternity, all of us created in the image of God. Because in Romans 5, verse 10, Paul says, while we were enemies, while we were enemies, God reconciled us to himself by the death of his son. That's a profound thing for us, that God has chosen to reconcile us as enemies to himself by the death of his son. Ray Ortlund says, he loves his enemies to make us his friends. His love is the only power in the universe that can change a human heart. So the gospel is it. There is no other power for us that can change a human heart. It is the gospel. And so us choosing to live sacrificially with those that are really difficult, those that think differently, believe differently, worship differently, or have abused us and wounded us significantly, the call is to sacrificially love. Again, it's not an easy call. So our third point is to wait humbly. Wait humbly. So again, so far we've seen the call to walk faithfully, to love sacrificially, and now to wait humbly. The text here is chapter 20, verse 22, chapter 24, verses 17 and 18, and lastly, chapter 28, verses 13 and 14. In all this, we must be reminded that God is God and we are not. Now, practically speaking, we know that. Of course, I'm not God. Of course, God is God and I am not. And yet, when it comes to living that out, sometimes we forget that. Look at chapter 20, verse 22. Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. It's the very same text that Paul picks up on that we just read, but the context is a little bit different because he doesn't use the tail end of what Solomon says here. So don't say, I'm going to choose to repay this. I'm going to take vengeance on my own. Wait for God. Why? Because he will deliver you. So to be delivered here means that there is a deliverer. If deliverance is going to come, it means that there has to be the one who is the deliverer, and that's God. It's not us. But the reality of the gospel is that God knows what it is to be maligned. God knows what it is to be spit upon, to be mocked, to be killed innocently. This is the one thing that separates Christianity from every other ideology, every other world religion, every other system of thought, is that God alone knows what it is to be betrayed. God alone knows what it is to suffer. God knows what it is to feel the spit of those that are angry with you falling across his face. God alone knows. That's why when it says, I will repay evil, trust me, I've got this. I am your deliverer. And if you're going to trust me for deliverance, then you must trust me completely. Because God knows what it is. We must wait humbly. We must wait humbly. Look at 24 verses 17 and 18. Do not rejoice when your enemy falls. Let not your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and turn away his anger from him. So he's saying, don't be arrogant. That's the imagery here of rejoicing, that your heart be glad. Like, don't be arrogant, don't boast, have heartfelt trust. Again, here's the image of the heart, again, over and over and over throughout the Bible, right? He's saying, don't let these things fester in your own heart. Eventually they're going to make their way out. So don't rejoice, don't hold these things in your heart. This is a hard thing to do, not just for you, but for me as well. Because I want to gloat when my enemy falls, when my enemy fails, when someone who's opposed to me stumbles and trips in what they say, like an inconsistency in their argument, something bad happens in their life. The truth is, I want to do this. I want to rejoice. I want to gloat. I want to let my heart be glad when they stumble. I do. But we must fight against that. Again, knowing that God is sovereign and we are not. And the context here in verse 18 is, you do this, God's going to turn his anger from them, meaning he's probably going to turn it toward you. Right? So don't let your heart go there. Don't rejoice. Don't be glad when your enemy trips up. Again, that is a very difficult thing to do. Again, we're not called to easy. But again, grace changes everything. So think of the story of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery. Eventually, he says, look, you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good, for the saving of lives. There's so many stories, again, stories throughout the Bible that point to this reality, that God is working all things for our good and for his glory. ultimately for faith in Christ. It's not first and foremost a list of rules and do's and don'ts and avoid this and don't watch that and don't click there. No, it's I love you and I'm for you. And if you trust me by faith in what my son has done for you, I will never leave you, never forsake you. At my right hand will be pleasures forevermore. I am good. You can trust me. So there's so many stories throughout the Bible that point to this reality of trusting in the midst of difficulty. Jesus' own life is that. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see this storyline of Easter, of him choosing to remain silent. Because to save himself means that he couldn't save us. And so instead, he stayed silent so that he could redeem us. So the goal in all of this, the goal in leveraging our relationships with enemies, with difficult people who are hard to get along with, the goal in all of this is that God is glorified. The goal is that Christ is magnified. The goal is that lives are changed, that mercy is experienced. So through our posture with our enemies, this is true. Look at chapter 28, verses 13 and 14. Last text this morning in Proverbs. Whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Blessed is the one who fears the Lord always. But whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. Extending mercy displays the cross to those around us. You, as an agent of reconciliation, as Paul says, when you extend mercy to someone else, you declare to them the beauty of the gospel. You hold up to them the beauty of the cross, to those who least deserve it. And those who least deserve it is all of us. Again, this is where the us and them breaks down. Because if we see ourselves as we are the ones who deserve this, then you don't understand the gospel. Because we, like our enemies, like everyone on planet Earth, don't deserve this. We don't deserve mercy. We don't deserve grace. If we did, it wouldn't be mercy and it wouldn't be grace. Because that's legalism. We perform and we get. Mercy is a free gift. Grace is a free gift from God toward us. Ezekiel 33:11 says, God says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked would turn from his ways and live. So God's heart for your enemy is that he would repent, that he would treasure Christ, that he would have life everlasting. The call for us from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32 is to forgive as God in Christ forgave you. Again, it's not easy. It's not easy for us to do this. So the question is, who's your biggest enemy this morning? For some of you, when I ask that question, there's a clear picture that comes to mind. Close the bedroom door, there's a dartboard, there's this picture. There's her picture right there. I don't have to think hard. Now I want to change one word in that question. Not who's your biggest enemy this morning. What's your biggest enemy this morning? Because that question has to precede every other question of relating to enemies. Because the reality, the answer to that question is sin. Some of you know the story of G.K. Chesterton. There was a paper in England that asked the question, what's wrong with the world today? And he took out a full-page ad and response and said, Dear sir, I am yours, G.K. Chesterton. It's a very comical response and yet gets to the heart at what I think needs to be seen in our lives. We tend to think others are the problem. The problem's out there. He's saying, no, the problem is in here. I'm the problem. Our biggest problem this morning, your biggest problem this morning is sin. Your sin embodied in your heart of flesh, still reigning in our mortal bodies, separating us from God vertically, from others horizontally, bringing death, bringing hell. That's our biggest enemy. And the beauty is that Christ is victorious over all of those, over our sin, over the separation between us and God, over death, over hell. Christ is victorious over all of those things. So only by faith in him is our biggest enemy conquered, so that then all of these subsequent smaller enemies seem to begin to be disarmed. They're not so big anymore. They're not so powerful anymore, because the biggest thing that stands in the way of our life and our holiness has been dealt with. So the call for us in all of these things is to let love motivate you in these relationships that we have with our enemies. So again, to walk faithfully, to love sacrificially, to wait humbly as those who've been reconciled to God by faith in Christ. So again, just that closing statement, we are called, all of us, to the very difficult task. Let me add that word in there. Not just to the difficult task, to the seemingly impossibly difficult task of wisely and winsomely loving our enemies. We must, because as former enemies of God, we've been reconciled to God, and our biggest enemy has been defeated. That's the hope for us. That's the hope, frankly, for our world.